So I want to thank you guys for jumping on, listening to the presentation on reducing indirect costs in manufacturing. I hate to be the one to burst a bubble. If you were coming here and you're thinking, "Oh man, Adam is just he's gonna enlighten us so much." Um, Unfortunately, reducing indirect costs is very similar to losing weight. It really only takes two things. It takes time and it takes knowledge. So what I want to do today is just kind of go over some of the things that we see. That way, maybe it plants a seed as for those that are here. I know you work with different organizations. Maybe it's things that you can mention to them to go ahead and review. But indirect costs are starting to become more and more of an issue. And we sat down with ADP, and ADP works with tens of thousands of customers or organizations. And they did a survey and asked them, what are the top three challenges that are facing you guys? And the top three challenges were finding qualified employees, increased cost of production, and supply chain disruptions. Right. And so those are, what we would expect them to be. Finding qualified employees is really out of the control of the business. Supply chain disruptions really out of the control of the business. The only thing that they can really kind of get their arms around is how do they reduce the cost of production. And traditionally, what will happen, manufacturers will be very, very good at controlling their direct costs or their strategic spend. Where they struggle is in that tail spend area, or what we would call the indirect costs. And the reasons for it make a lot of sense. This chart is really good at kind of laying out the direct versus the indirect. But if you look at the indirect spend, which is this bar and down, is that there's a high volume of suppliers versus your direct spend. So trying to get your arms around all of those suppliers is just a little bit taxing for organizations. And then additionally, there's a low financial impact compared to your direct costs. When you're looking at everything that it takes to directly make your product, those are traditionally your highest costs. So that's where most of the focus goes. And then the third contributing factor is the complexity is typically outside of the organization's expertise, right? They may be very, very good in understanding which components go into their manufacturing and understanding the market for those. Maybe less inclined to understand copiers and how much a good price point for page per print is. So what typically happens is they relegate all of those indirect costs to just being whatever is easiest to manage. Um, Couple that with the fact that a lot of the leadership in manufacturing comes from an engineering mindset where they say, okay, listen, I'm going to focus on the 20% of my suppliers that make up 80% of my costs. What's happened though is that the indirect costs have shifted and they no longer make up that very small percentage. When we go in and look at organizations, we'll find their indirect costs make up anywhere between 20 to 45% of their operations budget. And in our experience, we found that you can reduce those by anywhere from 30 to 50%. So the savings opportunity is really anywhere from 6% to 22% of an operations budget that they can reduce just by better managing those indirect costs. And it's kind of getting this shift away from the significant few versus the insignificant many to manufacturers. You're kind of dying a death by a thousand cuts, and if you don't get something around that, you're going to continue to bleed the money. So that's just kind of where we are and how we've gotten to this. What I want to talk about are what we've seen over the last 25 years. Where are the most common areas where there's opportunities for savings on indirect costs? And the four areas are, we'll find organizations are either over provisioned, under provisioned, they pay above market rates, or they're paying for billing errors that they're not aware of. And I'll deep dive into each one of these. And again, the reason is as you're working with clients, manufacturers, is that maybe you walk past something and it triggers you to ask them, hey, have you looked into this? And it may be a simple solution for them to kind of go after. So in the over provisioned area, there's a ton of ways that organizations can be over provisioned. These are some of the fun ones that I like to talk about. Software licenses. So we find a lot of organizations, they are over provisioned in their software licenses. And this is any type of software, but I'll give you a couple examples. Subscription needs not matching what they actually need. So what we found in a lot of organizations is they'll buy their employees Microsoft Office licenses. Unbeknownst to them, there are 18 different types of licenses they can have that range anywhere from $56 a month to $8 a month per license. An organization that we were working with, what we found was they had about 1,000 field employees that they wanted them to have just Outlook, just an opportunity for them to get their mail. And they were paying about $40 for a license for all of these employees. When after a review, we say, hey, all you need is that email. You can go down to the lowest level subscription, pay $8 a month, and that is a tremendous amount of savings for you. So those are things to look at is okay, what are my software needs and what kind of licenses can I purchase? Another way we find some savings for them is that they maintain licenses for former employees. And there's a disconnect between the IT and the HR, whether an employee is terminated or whether they retire, their employee number may be terminated, but IT will continue to maintain that license for them. So making sure there's a good connection of, how do we out process these employees to make sure anything that we were paying for ends. And then we found that there's a lot of opportunities for employees to share licenses, that they don't actually need their own individual one. And this one came to light at the onset of COVID when everyone started moving to e-signature. We found that e-signature was one of these software packages that not a lot of folks knew about, and they would purchase licenses for each employees when it wasn't necessary for them. They may have only needed one license that could be shared amongst 10 employees. So again, this is just conversations of, how do you know that you're provisioned correctly in your software? Telecom is a big one because as you've seen the industry change from the old phone lines to, then your cable provider offers it and then over to a VoIP solution, what you find is as technology changes, the old phone lines may not have been canceled. We see this in manufacturing a lot when they may shut down portions of their plants for whatever reason. They don't use them anymore, but they still continue to pay for the phone lines going into those buildings. That's something that they can shut off. The biggest one we found was for a company that has multiple locations in multiple states. They had a big conversion where they converted over to fiber going into their buildings about 4 years ago. What they failed to do was cancel all the phone lines. So they were spending about $750,000 a year on phone lines that were never canceled, that weren't being used. And that happened over 4 years. So as organizations get bigger, things like this get missed just because departments get segregated. So it's really anytime you see growth or reduction is a really good time to say, okay, is there anything that we're paying for that we don't need? The other thing that we find is for secondary cell phones. These are cell phones that are being issued to employees that maybe it's not their primary phone. They maintain their personal phone as their primary and the company issued phone as their secondary. The easiest thing to do for organizations is just to purchase an unlimited plan for $40 and give that employee a phone. But what happens for large organizations is they have a wide pocket of employees that they're not using all that data. And what they can do is they can actually, if they monitor the data, they can take those employees from a $40 plan each to put them into a shared plan where you're maybe paying $100 for 10 employees. And so that's about a $350 savings a month once they started doing that. So it's being aware of how much usage is happening on those phones. And then one that we've been telling a lot of our clients is these hotspots. They may have purchased hotspots during COVID that are no longer necessary for a multitude of reasons. Either they don't use them, or with the new cell phone technology, cell phones are hotspots in and of themselves. But what happens is those little MiFis, they get tossed in a drawer somewhere and nobody really thinks about them. But they're $35 a month that you'll continuously pay. So we always ask, do you have any hotspots? And then we validate on their bill that they're not paying for any. And then waste is a final area where you can be over provisioned. And this is for manufacturers who may have cyclical seasons where maybe they're busier in the summer and not as busy in the fall, but their waste pickups are scheduled regularly. So they'll have the same waste pickups. And what we always say is, once you go to negotiate that contract, you want to make sure that you're negotiating in if there's any sort of fluctuations. That way you're not paying to have a truck come pick up nothing. And then additionally, bin size is not being monitored for the proper usage. And this is where maybe there was a reduction in manufacturing in the output, and they may have had a large roll off in the past, but it's not getting filled as much. So whenever someone comes to pick it up, they're really paying to dump air. And so you really want to look to see, okay, is what we're using what we need? So the big takeaway here is anytime you have some sort of change in operations, either you expand or reduce, you really want to make sure that you're looking at your usage to make sure it matches what you've got. On the flip side of that, we see under provision. And under provision could be just as costly. We see this in different categories. In the utilities, what we'll see is time of use metering versus general service metering. And what will happen is an organization will sign up for time of use metering because it's cheaper to use to consume during off-peak hours. So they were flexible enough that they could consume during there. Operations may have expanded to now where they're using just as much on peak as they were off peak, which not only washes out the savings, but it also costs them more than just going back to general service metering. So we really want to make sure, and for manufacturers, electric consumption is one of their biggest costs. So that's one that we really want to make sure they focus on. The second is energy efficiency grant opportunities. As organizations increase their consumption, what'll happen is a lot of the distributors of electric, as well as the public utility commissions, will offer energy efficiency grants. And so as those pop up, you want to make sure that your clients are taking advantage of those, because it's money for them to implement items that will help them reduce their consumption. For telecom, what we'll find is monthly data overages for mobile accounts. This is where maybe they're set up on an old account where they're not unlimited and they continue to go over, but no one's really paying attention. They'll just pay the fee. And there's opportunities there to, again, if you move them over, you can save money on that one. And then shipping. The thing to keep in mind, and this isn't just with shipping, but with most of the vendors, is they will not call you to offer you a discount because your volume increased. Typically that's on you. They'll go ahead and let you know when your rates increase because your volume has declined. But typically when you move into that next level, they're not going to call you to let you know that, hey, you could be paying a lower rate. So as volumes increase on shipping, that's where you really want to make sure you're looking at it and going back to your vendor and saying, hey, we're now at this level. What discounted shipping rates does that provide us? And then additionally, you want to ask, okay, at what point will I move into the next level of discounts? Again, they're not going to call you for that. That's something that the companies need to be aware of on their own. Between being over provisioned and under provisioned, unless there's something really crazy, that's not where the bulk of the savings is going to be found, but that's where you're going to start tightening up your operations and really being focused on it. Paying above market rate is where most of the savings are going to be found. And companies pay above market rate for a multitude of reasons. One is that companies don't know what their services should actually cost. And a great example of this is organizations that their telecom bills, let's say $2,500 a month. And the CFO says, hey, we need to look for some savings. The controller reaches out and they contact their telecom company and they say, hey, this is what we've got. Either we're going to leave or you've got to lower our rates. And they give them a $200 discount a month. Well, everyone feels like that's a win because it's about a 10% savings. And so, they'll sign a new contract and they'll go with $2,300 a month. What they don't know though is that that telecom company would have actually accepted $1,800 a month and still maintained their service. And it's because they don't really, the only way they know what their services cost is based off of that anchor that their vendor has created for them. So I always recommend that when they do negotiations, the first thing they should be doing is reaching out to companies that are similar to them and find out what they're paying. That way you can kind of get an idea what is everyone else paying. That way I'm not just having one point of reference, but I'm having multiple points of references. The other issue is companies don't know how or who to negotiate with. Oftentimes they'll call and they'll negotiate with the first person they talk to, and that person, when they call back 3 months later, no longer works for that company. So they really want to make sure that they're talking to retention specialists that have been there for a while, that can actually know what levers they can pull to help them reduce their costs. One of the other things we find, companies often wait until last minute to renew or to review their auto renewal contracts. You see this a lot in the telecom and in the utilities. And what they need to do is, well before that window, in the contract, it'll say this contract will auto renew if written notice isn't given within 90 days of termination of this contract. And so what businesses will do is they'll start looking at that 90 days. That's when they start looking for other opportunities. At that point, it's a little too late, because uh, they're going to end up running out of time just because the process takes a little longer. They really want to back that up. And in about 6 months out, they really want to start looking to see what they can do. For utilities, what a lot of manufacturers don't know is they think they get locked into a 4-year, 5-year contract, and that they don't need to start looking until a few months before that contract expires. For the utilities, they can actually lock down a rate right now, even if their contract doesn't expire for 4 or 5 years. And that's the way to really do it, because what you're doing is, it's just like buying stocks. When you say, hey, when a stock hits this price, this is when I want to buy it. You can actually do that on the utilities and say, okay, when the kilowatt hours get to this price, this is when I want to lock in. And you can do that at any point in your contract. So again, it's just another way that they can save money. Normal fluctuations in billing amounts hide price creep. We see this a lot because businesses get so busy that they don't tend to look at their bills. And when you have a telecom bill that typically should be around the same every month, if you see a fluctuation, it triggers you. But on something like electricity, where your consumption changes, so your billing changes, if you're not scouring that and understanding what that bill is, that's where that rate creep happens, and you'll just write off increases in your price to consumption increases. So really looking at those bills that have fluctuations in the amount, that's how you're going to start catching that rate creep or that price creep. And then this one, I know you guys work with manufacturers, so you can attest to this, is traditionally in manufacturing, this is a broad brush to paint, but they are not the initial adapters of new technology. They're typically on the trailing edge of that. And what happens is they miss a lot of opportunity for savings. We have customers right now that if they switch to VoIP, they could be paying $5 a month. Instead, they're still paying $19.99 a phone line. And they'll do that for years because it's just the fear of the technology switch. There are a lot of opportunities if they just embrace that change. There's a lot of opportunities for them to reduce their costs. Again, paying above market rate is typically where the bulk of the savings could be found, if they can get down below what they're paying now. And then the final issue is billing errors. And for manufacturers, this is a big one, is the sales and use tax, because it's complicated, often requires accounting review to make sure that it's correct. So Mike, that's somewhere where, a service like what you guys do is very, very beneficial, because part of, they should be paying sales tax for part of it, but not all of it. We'll also find that they're being billed on canceled services. This is where they may have canceled a service and may have forgotten to verify that it was removed from their bill, and years go by before they actually start questioning it. And then the final one is they're not being billed in compliance with the contract. This doesn't happen as often anymore. Probably over the last 5 years, we found fewer and fewer instances of it, but it's where you'll agree to certain rate increases based on usage or based on inflation. If you negotiate that, that's the anomaly. They typically don't negotiate that. So what they normally do is when the inflation increases happen, they just do it across the board. And so you may get an inflation increase of 20% when you had previously negotiated 8%. And so you really just need to make sure that whoever's reviewing the bill also understands the contract to make sure that the bills are in line with the contract. So those are the four areas that we really see cause most of it. Why though? Why this happens and what some of the companies can do. First, as much as everyone loves their own employees, we have to realize that employees just aren't interested in reducing costs. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, but they're just not interested. So one of the things that we always recommend is create an incentive for reducing those costs. If you create the challenge and say, listen, whatever you save, we'll put a percentage of that into an employee fund. And once that hits a certain amount, we'll take the day off and we'll all go golfing. Whatever it is, create the incentive so that they're hungry. Because if you just tell them to go save money, their thought is, I'm going to save money for someone else to pad their pockets. And there's not a lot of interest in doing that. The other issue is there's not enough employees, right? And you guys see this all the time. There's just not enough employees to do what needs to be done. And then to ask them to specialize in all those vendors that are included in the indirect costs, that's tough to do. And that's where, just outsourcing makes the most sense because, as you saw, ADP's first issue that all the small businesses are facing is finding qualified labor. There's no real solution other than outsource it to someone else. The third is they're unaware of how to reduce costs. This is where chambers, manufacturing partners, your community, this is where you really reach out and you start asking what they've done and really get a feel for some of the best practices. That will let you know what others have done and then you can implement it in your organization. And then again, afraid to make changes. This is not only on the manufacturer side, just as an industry in general, but for employees, they're afraid to make changes. And I'll give you guys an example of this. If you have an issue and say you're paying a lot for your phones, and your controller comes to you and says, hey, we want you to explore options. Right now, you're paying more for your phones, but your phones work. The big fear is, what if we do something to change it and we save money, but our phones don't work as well as they do now? That's a big concern. So what organizations need to do is just narrow down the organizations they want to look at, the telecom organizations, whatever it is, narrow it down, learn about them, learn about their customer service, and then just embrace the fact that changes need to be made. So with that, I know we went through a lot, but again, I like to tell people that reducing indirect costs is just like losing weight. There's only two factors involved, and it's not complicated. You got to invest the time and you've got to gather the knowledge. Once you do that, you can really start putting a dent into those indirect costs. So with that, I'll open it up if there's any questions or any thoughts.
Hey, Adam, this was very informative. I think this is a lot of great information, and I absolutely understand, just the change management piece, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned this. Is this typically for manufacturers, or do you do this type of work for other industries?
I do it for all industries. So okay. This week I worked with a school district and I went to see a nonprofit. Okay. And then on Monday, I'm delivering a savings report to a car dealership.
Okay.
So it's very similar. The issues are very similar across the board. It's just with manufacturing. Manufacturing has seen, some organizations have seen an explosion in growth, and others have seen an implosion or contraction. And that's usually what happens. What ends up costing them money is something in their business changed, but they didn't go back and review what they're paying for.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting because we were talking about school districts and nonprofits. one of the questions I have would be the size of clients you typically work with, or Schooling Mitchell works with.
Yeah, typically the way we say it is if they have a CFO in multiple locations, that typically indicates that they've got enough bills that we'll be able to find them some appreciable savings.
Okay, so single entity units typically isn't the sweet spot.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, that's good enough.
So, well, with that, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and hope when you run into clients, you're able to give them some insights, help them save some money.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to see you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you. Take care, guys.